Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at d1baseball.com. I'm your host, Joe Healy, joined as always by my good friend and co-host, Mark Etheridge. We are continuing our series of 2025 SEC baseball team previews. By the time opening day rolls around, we will have done 16 of these, and we roll on as we head to the, we're working alphabetically. We're getting towards the middle of the alphabet here. We're going to talk about Ole Miss today, and boy, that's a fascinating one. Just given where they're at, they're basically in the place where their rival Mississippi State was this time last year. Back-to-back seasons of missing the NCAA tournament. Ole Miss was on paper better last year because they made the SEC tournament in the last year in which you had to qualify for the SEC tournament, but ultimately lost to rival Mississippi State in the opening game, and that was all she wrote for their season. There's a little bit of renewed optimism there, Mark. I know our colleague Aaron Fitt saw them in the fall and liked what he saw, but I would chalk up a lot of the optimism, Mark, to just like there's some familiar names on the mound, and that group is healthier on paper than perhaps they have been in a while. So that to me seems like where if you're really going to put on some rose-colored glasses about this team, like I think that's where you look first.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at it, Hunter Elliott, who we all remember from their title run, was one of their two best pitchers. Him finally being healthy and looking right, I think that's one of the real keys to the season. Where what do you get out of him? Because if he's back the way he was a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, this is a legit SEC Friday guy, and Ole Miss really hadn't had one in a while. I mean, really since that year when they had a couple of them. I do think that getting Riley Maddox back, getting Mason Nichols back, Connor Spencer, the closer from a year ago, all of those guys could have gone pro and did not. And I really think, a lot of people maybe not be enamored with how the NIL process works, but this is an absolutely wonderful part of the sport where you have guys that return to school and they're able to return, older guys, and you retain them on your team. Okay. So those are great. If that works out for the kid where he can make some money and try to develop and increase his draft stock for the following year, maybe work closer towards that degree, maybe get started on grad school, whatever their situation is. Those are all positives, right? And I'm really excited for Ole Miss because, from a fan's perspective, you kind of get tired of the revolving door roster, right? You start to get, connected to a guy, and next year he's playing for somebody else. So that part for me is really exciting for Ole Miss. And then on the field, you've got some guys with experience who have been through the wars, taken some lumps in some cases on teams that weren't as good as projected to be, but you get better, right, with all that experience and the other part of this, and we haven't talked about it yet, is Ole Miss Mike Bianco brought in a pitching coach, Joel Mangrum, I think he's with the Guardians, right? So in their organization as the minor league pitching coordinator. So that'll be interesting because instead of, Mike Bianco was his own pitching coach, well, now you've got two voices there. So what does that look like? Because, Mike can continue to run the overall program, and this day and age, that's more than a full-time job. But he's also been in the league so long that he can guide, Mangrum through his first voyage, through the SEC as a pitching coach. So I'm curious to see what adjustments Ole Miss will make, what it looks like, or is it something, from the outside that we can even determine. But results we'll be able to determine, and that's a huge question, as we go into it. Because I look at this rotation, and I'm feeling pretty good about it. If I'm Ole Miss, I mean, that's not a bad group of characters to throw out there on a weekend. So if they meet expectations, I mean, Ole Miss they're going to be in the mix to get back in the postseason.
Yeah, I think certainly one thing I like about this pitching group, I mean, one is obviously the Hunter Elliott piece, and you can look at it two ways. Like I mentioned this on one of our D1 baseball internal chats, but it's just been a long time since we saw Hunter Elliott be Hunter Elliott. I mean, that's by the time opening day rolls around, it'll basically been 2.5 years since we saw him be himself. Remember, he started the 2023 year as their Friday guy, got hurt right away. It never really came back. Last year came back at some, late and through a little bit, but this will be the first time where it's like a full go, let's see what you got kind of deal. And so I think you can look at that negatively, where it's like a lot of time has passed. Like, is he the same guy? Or you can look at it positively, and it's just that, well, Tommy John has a pretty high success rate, and he's been out a really long time. So they didn't rush him back. They let him kind of naturally ramp up in a way that made sense. And now he should be ready to go. It just makes me a little uncomfortable that it feels like so much hinges on Hunter Elliott being a guy that we saw in 2022, which is just a long time ago. But what I like about this pitching staff, generally speaking, is that it does feel like there's a little bit of a larger percentage of pitchability on this pitching staff. And I think one thing we have learned is that, yes, you got to have stuff in the SEC. You got to get strikeouts. Totally get it. But if you don't have pitchability, you just got erratic stuff. And I think we've seen, whether it's Grayson Saunier or whether it's JT Quinn, like guys that had pretty impressive stuff, but just struggled with the pitchability piece. Even Liam Doyle to some degree, like he threw a lot of strikes, but it was still a guy who was more arm than pitcher. And we'll see if Tennessee can do something different with him this year. I suspect there's a good chance they will, but I look at this pitching staff and the guys you rattle off, whether it's Maddox, obviously we talked about LA, but Maddox and Nichols and, even a transfer like Will McCausland from St. Joe's, like not the biggest arm, it's fine, but he's just going to throw a ton of strikes. And if you're going one way or the other, you'd rather have, hey, you might get hit a little bit, but at least you're throwing strikes and competing, versus the alternative, which is like, you're not giving us a chance because you're not throwing enough strikes. And then when you go in the zone, we're getting pounded. You'll obviously prefer the former, and we'll find out if it's good enough or not. But I think that's a good sign here. I think other teams in the SEC have kind of paved the way for that. I mean, Kentucky's pitching staff the last couple of years, it's not like they've had just total dudes on the mound the last couple of years, but they threw a ton of strikes for the most part, and they competed, and it was good enough most of the time, right? That team, 2 back-to-back deep postseason runs for that team without guys that you would say are just like total elite level arm talents. And so it feels to me like, hey, look, if you can't be 2022 Tennessee in the rotation, with Dolander, Burns, and Beam, then go the other way and just be pitchability and throw a bunch of strikes and try to make that work. And that feels like that's kind of where they're at.
Yeah. Something struck me as you were talking, with losing Quinn, Saunier, and Doyle. Those are 3 really, really good pitchers who will play key roles on their next teams. You lost them to the portal, and still
all of them to the SEC, by the way.
Yeah, all of them within the league, and we still think Ole Miss will be better on the mound than they were last year. And that's
it might be one of those classic cases where, like, it might be better for all parties, right? Like, if you told me that Doyle is a potential all SEC guy on the mound, I wouldn't be shocked. If you told me Saunier and Quinn have roles at Texas and Georgia and are important pieces, I'd believe you there. There's going to be less with Saunier and Quinn in particular. There's going to be a little less heat on them, right? I mean, those guys were expected to be real dudes from the jump for Ole Miss, and now at Texas and Georgia, it seems like they'll be role players basically. And maybe that's just what they need.
With a chance for more, right?
With a chance to earn more, but certainly at least from the jump, probably just guys that are going to work their way into roles. And so, again, maybe it's just like sometimes in life, breakups are best for all parties, and maybe that's what we'll end up with here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing on the pitching is last year they struggled so much behind the plate. Just, pass balls and errors, and just it was just so difficult. And that's got to mess with you mentally, right? When you can't trust your catcher, at least not to the level that you need to. and that, from all indications, has been addressed. They've got different options there, So I think that on the mound, maybe you can throw that 2-strike curveball with a runner on third. That you can do those sorts of things, and it's just it'll be I guess a refreshing change, for Ole Miss after really struggling. That was such a bone of contention. Every time you watched Ole Miss, you were worried about those sorts of things. So I do feel that if defensively, if Ole Miss has improved like we feel, that just kind of limits how good the pitchers have to be, and you can kind of do your own thing without that being the lingering black cloud over your head while you're on the mound.
On the lineup side, it feels like, you tell me if I'm wrong about this presumption here. It feels like if you force me to pick out one thing on the lineup side that is going to kind of determine where they are, it's, is a potential all transfer outfield of Ryan Moorman from Illinois, Isaac Humphrey from Louisville, and Mitch Sanford from New Orleans. Are those guys ready to hit SEC pitching? Humphrey, I think we should have some level of comfort because he was a productive player at Louisville, a ACC program. But, Moorman had a breakout year in a Big Ten program. Now, that was a good team last year in Illinois, but he hit like 260. Is that problematic? Mitch Sanford, this is his second go-around in the SEC. He started his career at LSU. Is it just that he's a lot better player now than he was back then? That could be. Or maybe he's just a step below high-level SEC performer. We'll find out this season. But to me, again, if you force me to pick out, hey, Joe, tell us what's going to be the determinant of how good this team is in the lineup, to me, it's, does that outfield hit enough, that all transfer outfield hit enough to make the lineup go?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And they're expecting them to hit for power. I mean, beer showers and all, with your 3 transfer outfielders. So they need to be the middle of the order. Another guy that they're really high on is Judd Udemark. I mean, just a physical freak, can do, big, fast, strong, you name it, he can do it. Other than, he hasn't been able to stay healthy. And so the big question is, one, he's got to stay on the field, and two, he's got this enormous potential. Can he harness it, and can he become, a difference maker in the middle of that lineup? Because if he does, I mean, this guy can play all over the field, give you some flexibility to move some other things around based on the pitching matchup. That's, there's not a lot of players as talented as him. So, does the light come on? Another Owen Pano, the freshman, big kid, shortstop, really highly regarded, another super talented kid. How does he handle, as he steps into SEC play as a freshman? Freshman shortstop, I mean, a lot of times you can come in and succeed if you have the ability, but it's also a steep learning curve because everybody's, a step faster and sometimes 2 steps faster on the infield to make that play. So I think those are 2 key players that Ole Miss needs production from, that that haven't done it right. Certainly at this level. I think the other thing is Luke Hill, who came in last year. We expected him to be a immediate impact player, and at times he was. But where is he this year? Is he going to be is he be your 3-hole hitter, right? Or hit, second or third and be a productive player for this team? Because he's certainly got the ability. It could be an early round pick if he continues that maturation. And last year it was a bit uneven. So what do you get out of him? So we mentioned some really talented players that if they take a step up, Ole Miss gets a whole lot better, and then they're ready to compete with, for a postseason berth. Otherwise, it's going to be a struggle, and that's kind of where we are. Another team that, there's some volatility between in outcomes based on how some of their players handle the step up to SEC play.
Yeah, and that's I think that's a good place for us to move on to like the last piece that I wanted to talk about here. It's that we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the bigger picture here, where
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't that long ago this team was holding a trophy in Omaha, and yet
Mm-hmm.
there's still a lot of questions about the overall health and trajectory of this program. It's I think it's part of the reason why Mike Bianco brought in a pitching coach is just the
Mm-hmm.
understanding that the last 2 years were obviously not good enough. But I wrote this in the preseason snapshot for Ole Miss that we put together, is just that if you're a detractor, I think you can look back and say, look at the last 2 years, and then, oh, by the way, the year we won the national title, one more regular season loss, and we're just not in the field. And so, you can nitpick that way. Or if you're bullish, you can look at it and say, look, we like 2 years ago, we won the national championship, something that we had never done in this
Mm-hmm.
program. And so I think it's like an ink blot test. You can look at it pretty much any way you want to look at it. The other thing is the other piece of this is that we're not just talking about, like, look, you compare it to Mississippi State with Chris Lemonis before last season, where it's like there was heat on him and you could make some of the same arguments on either side of it. But ultimately Chris Lemonis had been in the job a few years. He wasn't, I guess I'll just put it succinctly. You compare that to Mike Bianco and he kind of is Ole Miss baseball. Like for all you youngsters that don't know, go take a look at Ole Miss baseball before Mike Bianco arrived. And I'm not saying that should give him a pass for everything, right? That's not what I'm saying, but I am saying it's a little bit different than like Mississippi State looking at Chris Lemonis, in that you do have to consider the history, what he's meant to the program, like just all of that stuff. There's a lot more context here than there is in some other places, but they nearly made a move. And this is not me just speaking out of turn. Chase Parham, a
Mm-hmm.
friend of mine and yours, wrote in his book that Keith Carter was prepared to make a change in 2022 when it looked like they were not going to
Yeah.
make the postseason. And then ultimately he had to shelve those plans because they made the postseason and they kept winning. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like Ole Miss has never even considered it. Right. So that's obviously going to be hanging over all of this season for Ole Miss. And while it's not necessarily a fun thing to spend a third of our podcast talking about it, again, I think we'd be remiss not to talk about it because it's just the reality of the situation and of the business.
Yeah. We had them out, in our bracketology of the field the year they won it. And we're sort of surprised that the committee put them in. And they were one of, if not the last team in the field. And you just, when you're at that level, what if there's one more stolen bid, right? One more upset in a conference tournament. That's not even affecting you, right? No, you can't control any of that. So that was, I've always thought, that was one of the more fascinating storylines that we've covered here. Yeah, with D1 is just how they got in and then made the most of it, and obviously played lights out the rest of the way once they got their opportunity. And that's the thing. And Ole Miss has been the program, right? I mean, for so long, they were the team that had really good regular seasons, and then something would happen, sometimes in very disappointing ways to lose in the postseason. And even though many times they were the better team, so it's been kind of so I thought that was sort of poetic that they had a disappointing regular season and then took flight to win it all. Just some symmetry there. Uh, Looking ahead, I mean, it's been two disappointing seasons. Certainly, from an SEC standpoint, it was even the title season was disappointing. I do think that uh, when you are able to make changes, bringing in a pitching coach, they're certainly leaning into the NIL. They've brought in a lot of portal players. They've been able to retain, some guys that they wanted to hang on to. The emphasis on being able to adjust to today's world seems to be there. Now it's all about results, and in this league, it's so unforgiving. We talk about this on every in every team's deal. If you're not one of the top players, it's so tough if you drop one you shouldn't, or you let you have an injury situation and it causes you to have a bad weekend. Things like that are because the margins are so small. And now that with adding Texas and Oklahoma to the league, it's even more challenging because somebody's those are two really good programs. Somebody's catching losses, and you could be say Ole Miss finishes 13th, right, in the SEC, and the committee says, well, we're kind of thinking 12. What does that mean? Are you able to get in? Maybe you are one of the best 64, but there's not room for you based on an arbitrary cap. And all of those things, that could be the difference in whether this staff is around next year or not, okay, based on an arbitrary cap by the committee. So obviously fascinating for us to talk about. But, if you're a team in this league, you've just got to win enough that you take it out of the committee's hands, because we all realize that this is a really good league, but you still have to win games, and just showing up with the patch on your jersey is not enough. You've got to be able to prove it and show the results. So that's going to be the thing is I look ahead to Ole Miss's season. I mean, they're going to get started right away. Opening weekend, they play Arizona, Texas, and is it Louisville? I mean, or is it Clemson? It's Clemson, isn't it? So anyway, it's really tough. They go to.
I'm looking it up. Go ahead and vamp. I got you.
It's really. Anyway, they're going to find out right away. Can they compete with some of the best teams in the country? So don't take too much out of that one weekend, but you want to see how you look, right? You want to know that you belong on a field with some of the best teams in the country. So that for me is, Ole Miss is going to head into conference play. You've got a really good home field advantage. You're going to get some good programs in there that you feel like you need to take care of business. And if you play well at home and don't get swept on the road, you got a shot. And I think that's the minimum that Ole Miss has to do. Obviously, if you get more than that, you take all the mystery out of it, and we move on to the postseason, and then this staff moves on to next season. Otherwise, it's going to get dicey.
Yeah, it is Clemson opening weekend. Louisville's also in that tournament, but Texas plays Louisville, but not Ole Miss. I think that's a good encapsulation of it there at the end, Mark, that is the way the SEC giveth and taketh away. That if you win enough games, it doesn't really matter how good you actually are or aren't. It's one of the leagues, the ACC is a little bit like this, but in most leagues in college baseball, like, yes, you win enough conference games, that's a start, but then you get evaluated on, like, is this team actually good? In the SEC, if you win enough games, like, that's all you need. But on the other hand, somebody's got to lose games. And if you look around and can't find the team that's going to lose games, you might be the team. Yeah. And that goes for everybody. So that's just kind of a perfect encapsulation of where the league is. And certainly Ole Miss kind of finds itself in that position where it's going to have to scratch and claw to get back to the postseason in 2025. And that's what makes them extremely fascinating to watch. That is going to do it for this edition of Highway to Hoover podcast, production of SEC Extra over at d1baseball.com. Again, 16 of these podcasts going up before opening day, so make sure you are subscribed to the podcast feed, the Highway to Hoover podcast, so you make sure you get all of them in your podcast feed ahead of opening day, which is barreling towards us very, very quickly. But thank you to Mark for joining me as always, and thank you, the listener, for listening. We'll talk